The wind howled across the northern moors like a creature dying in agony, and somewhere in that frozen wasteland, they said Lucian Dravenhart had breathed his last. The Duke of Stormhollow, a man whose very name commanded respect in the highest circles of society, had vanished into the unforgiving landscape on a mission that should have been routine, but had instead become his grave. Or so the kingdom believed. Lucian had been born into privilege, but not into softness. His father, the previous duke, had been a stern man who believed that nobility came not from birthright, but from character forged in adversity. From his earliest years, Lucian had been trained in the arts of war, diplomacy, and leadership. He learned to read men's intentions in the flicker of their eyes, to sense danger in the shift of political winds, to command respect without raising his voice. By the time he inherited the dukedom at 23, he had already distinguished himself in several military campaigns, earning a reputation as both a brilliant strategist and a man of unshakable honor. Stormhollow itself was a formidable estate, perched on the cliffs overlooking the wild northern sea. The castle had stood for centuries, its grey stone walls weathered by salt spray and storms, a testament to the endurance of the Dravenhart line. The duchy was prosperous, its lands rich in timber and minerals, its people loyal. Lucian took his responsibilities seriously, riding out regularly to visit even the smallest villages, ensuring that justice was fairly administered and that no family went hungry. His tenants spoke of him with genuine affection, not merely the obligatory respect owed to a landlord, but it was at court where Lucian truly shone. The young duke moved through the glittering ballrooms and shadowy corridors of power with equal ease, his keen intelligence and natural charisma making him a favorite of the king. He sat on the Privy Council, advised on matters of state, and was frequently called upon to mediate disputes between feuding nobles. Yet for all his success, there remained something untamed about him, a restlessness that suggested he had not yet found what he truly sought. Then he met Evelina Harrowell, and everything changed. She had just made her debut at court, the daughter of the Marquess of Greystone, and she entered society like a sunrise breaking over a dark horizon. Evelina possessed a beauty that went beyond mere prettiness. Her hair was the color of chestnuts in autumn, her eyes a striking grey-green that seemed to shift with her moods like the sea. But it was her spirit that truly captivated those who knew her. She had been educated far beyond what was typical for young ladies of her station, her father believing that an intelligent daughter was an asset rather than a liability. She spoke 3 languages fluently, could discuss philosophy and literature with genuine insight, and possessed a wit that could cut or charm depending on her purpose. Their first meeting occurred at a reception hosted by the Russian ambassador. Lucian had been cornered by a particularly tedious baroness who seemed determined to secure him as a husband for her simpering daughter. He was contemplating a strategic retreat when a clear voice beside him said, "Your Grace, forgive my interruption, but didn't you promise to show me that fascinating Venetian painting in the East Gallery?" Lucian turned to find Evelina regarding him with eyes that sparkled with mischief and an expression of perfect innocence. Without missing a beat, he offered his arm. "Of course, Lady Evelina, how could I forget?" They walked in silence until they were well clear of the reception rooms, then both burst into laughter. "I apologize for the deception," Evelina said, "but you looked rather like a fox caught in a snare, and I've always had a soft spot for trapped creatures." Lucian found himself genuinely charmed. "Then I am doubly in your debt, my lady, first for the rescue, and second for comparing me to something far more dignified than I felt at that moment." They spent the next hour in conversation, discovering a rare compatibility of minds and temperaments. When Lucian finally escorted her back to her chaperone, he knew with absolute certainty that he had found the woman he wanted to marry. The courtship that followed was everything a romance should be. Lucian was attentive but not overbearing, passionate but respectful. He brought Evelina rare books from his library, took her riding in the countryside where they could speak freely away from prying eyes, wrote her letters that revealed the depths of his mind and heart. Evelina responded with equal ardor. She saw in Lucian not just a powerful duke, but a man of genuine integrity, someone whose strength was matched by kindness, whose intelligence never descended into arrogance. They shared dreams of the future, of modernizing Stormhollow, of raising children who would be both noble in birth and character, of growing old together with minds still sharp and hearts still tender. The Marquis of Greystone gave his blessing readily. Lucian was everything a father could want for his beloved daughter, titled, wealthy, honorable, and clearly devoted to Evelina. The betrothal was announced to great celebration, and plans began for a wedding that would be one of the social events of the season. Those who saw them together spoke of how rare it was to witness such genuine affection between two people of their station, where marriages were usually matters of alliance rather than love. Evelina would lie awake at night, her heart so full she felt it might burst, scarcely able to believe her good fortune in finding a man who seemed to have been fashioned specifically for her soul. But fate, as it so often does, had other plans. The summons came in the depths of winter, delivered by a grim-faced messenger bearing the king's seal. Lucian was to lead a confidential mission to the Northern Territories, where reports of unrest among the border clans threatened to escalate into open rebellion. The matter required a man of diplomatic skill and military prowess, someone the king trusted absolutely. It was meant to be a brief expedition, 6 weeks at most, and Lucian had no reason to suspect anything amiss. He kissed Evelina goodbye in the gardens of her father's estate, promising to return in time to see the first spring flowers bloom. "I'll wear your colors," he told her, touching the ribbon she'd given him, "and think of you every moment, until I hold you again." She watched him ride away, his figure gradually disappearing into the winter mist, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The mission was doomed from the start, though Lucian didn't realize it until far too late. The intelligence he'd been given was deliberately misleading, the maps inaccurate, the promised support from local allies nowhere to be found. The contingent of soldiers assigned to accompany him was smaller than requested, and as they pushed deeper into the hostile northern wilderness, Lucian began to suspect that the mission's true purpose was not what he'd been told. His second-in-command, a grizzled veteran named Captain Thorne, pulled him aside one frozen evening and spoke in a low voice. "Your Grace, something's wrong here. The men feel it. This doesn't smell like a diplomatic mission, it smells like a trap." Lucian's instincts told him Thorne was right, but by then they were too far from civilization to turn back safely. The northern winter was brutal, with temperatures that could kill an exposed man in hours, and snowstorms that descended with terrifying speed. They pressed on, reaching the remote fortress where the negotiations were supposedly to take place, only to find it garrisoned by mercenaries rather than the clan leaders they'd expected to meet. The attack came at dawn, swift and coordinated, far too professional to be a spontaneous assault. Lucian fought like a demon, his sword flashing in the pale northern light, shouting orders even as he tried to organize a defense against overwhelming odds. The battle was chaos and carnage. Lucian saw men he'd trained with, men he'd come to respect, cut down around him. Captain Thorne took an arrow to the throat while covering Lucian's retreat. The young lieutenant who'd spoken excitedly about his upcoming marriage bled out in the snow, clutching a letter from his bride. Lucian himself took wounds that should have been fatal, a sword thrust that glanced off his ribs, a blow to the head that sent him sprawling half-conscious into the freezing water of a mountain stream. As darkness closed over his vision, his last coherent thought was of Evelina, of how he'd broken his promise to return to her, of how she would mourn him without ever knowing the truth of what had happened here. But Lucian Dravenheart did not die that day, though perhaps he came as close to death as a man can come and still draw breath. He was found by an old woman from one of the remote mountain villages, a healer who recognized the quality of his clothes and weapons even beneath the blood and grime. She dragged him back to her cottage, more corpse than man, and spent weeks coaxing life back into his broken body. Lucian drifted in and out of consciousness, lost in fevered dreams where he fought the same battle over and over, where Evelina's face appeared like an angel just beyond his reach. The old woman, whose name was Marta, had seen enough of war to know a betrayed man when she nursed one. She asked no questions, simply kept him alive with her herbs and her stubborn refusal to let death claim another victim to the machinations of powerful men. When Lucian finally woke with a clear mind, winter had given way to early spring. He was skeletal, scarred, so weak he could barely stand. Marta told him the news that had reached even her remote village, that the Duke of Stormhollow and his entire company had perished in the north, ambushed by rebels in a tragic incident that the king himself had mourned. No survivors, the report said, no bodies recovered. The frozen wilderness had claimed them all. Lucien's hands clenched into fists as he listened, understanding at last the full scope of the conspiracy against him. Someone at court had wanted him dead badly enough to sacrifice 24 good soldiers to make it happen. Someone with enough power to falsify reports, to ensure that no real search was conducted, to have him declared dead with convenient haste. The question that burned in his mind, even more than thoughts of vengeance, was what had become of Evelina. Marta had no information about the personal affairs of nobles, and Lucien was in no condition to travel. He spent months in that mountain cottage, slowly rebuilding his strength, practicing with his sword until his arms no longer trembled, running through the forest until his lungs no longer burned. Marta watched his transformation with sad eyes, recognizing the cold determination of a man who had stared into the abyss and returned with darkness in his heart. "Revenge is a bitter meal, Your Grace," she told him once, but Lucien only smiled grimly. "I seek justice, not revenge. Though I confess at this point I'm not entirely certain there's a difference." During those months of recovery, Lucien had ample time to think. He analyzed everything he knew about the mission, about who had proposed it, who had access to the king's confidence, who would benefit from his death. The picture that emerged was troubling but not entirely surprising. Court politics had always been a dangerous game, but Lucien had thought himself too valuable, too favored by the king to be worth murdering. Clearly he'd underestimated either the desperation or the ambition of his enemies. What gnawed at him most was the thought that Evelina would believe him dead, that she would grieve and eventually be pressured to move on with her life. The thought of her married to another man, bearing another man's children, growing old in some other man's house, it was a torture more exquisite than any physical wound he'd suffered. When he was finally ready to leave, Lucien embraced Marta and pressed into her hands a ring bearing his family crest. "When I reclaim what was taken from me," he told her, "send word to Stormhollow. You'll want for nothing for the rest of your days, I swear it." The old woman shook her head. "I didn't save you for reward, boy. I saved you because it was right. But I'll hold on to this as a reminder that sometimes the dead come back, and the wicked should sleep less soundly for it." The journey south was long and arduous. Lucien traveled in disguise, a nameless wanderer in rough clothes attracting no attention. He listened in taverns and coaching inns, gathering information about what had transpired in his absence. What he learned made his blood run cold. His duchy had been placed under the management of a court-appointed administrator, his assets frozen, his closest allies scattered or silenced. And Evelina, his Evelina, had been promised to Lord Ronan Whitmore, a wealthy viscount with impeccable bloodlines and a reputation for ruthless ambition thinly veiled by polished manners. Lucien had encountered Whitmore before at court, had always found something unsettling about the man's too smooth charm, the calculation visible in his eyes when he thought himself unobserved. The idea of Evelina in such a man's power filled Lucien with a rage so intense it threatened to overwhelm his careful planning, but he forced himself to patience. He could not simply ride up to the palace gates and announce his survival. Those who had tried to kill him would simply try again, and this time they would succeed. He needed proof of the betrayal, needed allies he could trust, needed to orchestrate his return in a way that would give his enemies no time to react. He began by seeking out the few men he knew beyond doubt would believe him, veterans of previous campaigns, men who owed him their lives or their fortunes, men whose honor was beyond corruption. One by one he contacted them, revealing himself in secret, swearing them to silence. Their shock at seeing him alive was gratifying but also sobering, for it confirmed how thoroughly the court had accepted his death as fact. These men became his eyes and ears, feeding him information about the movements and machinations of the nobility, helping him piece together the conspiracy that had nearly cost him everything. The architect of his attempted murder, it turned out, was not a single mastermind, but a cabal of nobles who had seen in Lucien's death an opportunity to redistribute his wealth and influence. Lord Ronan Whitmore was deeply involved, having coveted not just Evelina, but also certain strategic lands that bordered his own estates. The King's chief minister, Lord Blackwood, had provided the false intelligence and arranged for the inadequate military support, motivated by old grudges and the promise of a share in the spoils. Even some of Lucien's supposed friends had betrayed him, their jealousy and ambition proving stronger than loyalty. But the discovery that wounded Lucien most deeply was that Evelina's own father, the Marquis of Greystone, had been quick to accept the betrothal to Whitmore. Whether the Marquis had been complicit in the plot or simply opportunistic in its aftermath, Lucien couldn't yet determine. But the betrayal stung nonetheless. He had respected Greystone, had believed the man cared for his daughter's happiness. To learn that he'd been willing to hand Evelina over to Whitmore mere months after Lucien's supposed death suggested either callousness or cowardice, neither of which Lucien could forgive. What Lucien didn't yet know, what none of his informants could tell him, was how Evelina herself had fought against the betrothal. When news of Lucien's death had reached her, she had collapsed, her grief so overwhelming that her family feared for her sanity. For weeks she had refused food, refused visitors, refused to accept the reality of a world without Lucien in it. She had pleaded with her father to delay any talk of a new marriage, had begged for time to mourn properly. But the Marquis, under pressure from creditors and political enemies that Lucien's disappearance had emboldened, had grown desperate. Whitmore had offered not just a generous settlement, but also protection, political influence that could shield the Greystone family from those who might seek to exploit their sudden vulnerability. Evelina had resisted with every fibre of her being. She had argued, wept, even threatened to enter a convent rather than marry Whitmore. But her father had played his final, cruelest card. He had revealed that the family's finances were in far worse condition than anyone had realized, that debts were coming due, that without a strategic marriage, her younger sisters would be ruined, left with no dowries and no prospects. Faced with the destruction of her entire family, Evelina had finally reluctantly agreed to the betrothal, though she had insisted on the longest possible engagement, clinging to some desperate, irrational hope that if she delayed long enough, somehow Lucien would return to her. She knew it was madness. Dead men did not come back. She had seen the dispatch from the north, had read the king's own letter of condolence, had attended the memorial service where prayers were said for Lucien's soul. Yet she could not make herself believe it. At night, she would wake from dreams where Lucien was calling to her, his voice urgent and desperate, and she would lie in the darkness wondering if she was going mad or if some part of her soul simply refused to accept his absence from the world. She wore the ring he'd given her on a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her gowns, and sometimes she would clutch it so tightly that it left marks on her palm, needing that small pain to anchor her in reality. Lord Ronan Whitmore courted her with patient persistence, seeming to understand that he was wooing a woman whose heart belonged to a ghost. He brought her flowers, read poetry to her, spoke of the future in gentle, reassuring tones. To the outside world, he appeared the perfect suitor, attentive but not overbearing, respectful of her grief, willing to wait for her to warm to him. But Evelina, with the instincts Lucien had always admired, sensed something false beneath Whitmore's polish. The way his eyes would harden when he thought she wasn't looking, the edge in his voice when he spoke of Lucien, the possessiveness in his touch when he took her hand, all of it set her teeth on edge. She felt like a prize he had won rather than a woman he loved, and the feeling grew stronger with each passing week. The worst part was that no one seemed to understand her reluctance. Her mother sighed and spoke of duty. Her father grew impatient with what he saw as unreasonable mourning for a man who was gone. Her friends, well-meaning but thoughtless, assured her that time would heal her wounds, that Whitmore was a good match, that she was lucky to have attracted such a devoted suitor so soon after her tragedy. Only her maid, Sarah, who had been with her since childhood, seemed to grasp the depth of Evelina's despair. Sarah would hold her while she wept, would listen to her fevered insistence that Lucien was still alive somewhere, would say nothing when Evelina refused to remove the hidden ring or pack away the letters Lucien had written her. As autumn turned to winter once more, the date of the wedding drew inexorably closer. Whitmore had been patient, but his patience was not infinite, and the social pressure for Evelina to overcome her mourning and embrace her future grew increasingly intense. The Great Winter Ball was announced, a lavish affair hosted by the Duke of Marlborough, one of the most influential nobles at court. Every family of consequence would attend, and it was understood that Evelina and Whitmore would appear together, presenting themselves as an official couple. The invitation felt to Evelina like a death sentence, the final nail in the coffin of her old life and her old dreams. Meanwhile, Lucian had been meticulously planning his return. He had gathered enough evidence of the conspiracy to damn his enemies, had secured the loyalty of enough powerful men to ensure he would be heard. But he needed the perfect moment, a time when the entire court would be assembled, when his dramatic reappearance would cause maximum disruption and make it impossible for his enemies to move against him before he could state his case. When he learned of the Winter Ball, he knew his moment had come. It would be theatrical, even reckless, but it would also be devastatingly effective. He would rise from the dead in full view of the kingdom's elite, and in doing so, he would reclaim everything that had been taken from him. The night of the ball arrived with fresh snow falling on the city, making the streets treacherous, and the world seem hushed and expectant. Evelina dressed in white silk, feeling like a lamb being adorned for sacrifice. Her mother fussed over her hair, chattering about how beautiful she looked, how proud they would all be to see her and Lord Whitmore together. Evelina said nothing, her mind far away, thinking of another ball, another life, when she had danced with Lucian and felt as though she could touch the stars. She touched the hidden ring one last time before leaving her room, a silent prayer to a dead man that he would forgive her for what she was about to do. The ballroom at Marlborough House was a vision of winter splendor. Hundreds of candles cast golden light over the assembled guests, their jewels glittering like stars. The orchestra played from a raised gallery, filling the space with music that should have been joyful, but felt to Evelina like a dirge. She entered on her father's arm, with Whitmore hovering close beside them, and immediately felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. The whispers started, "Poor Lady Evelina. Such a tragedy, losing the Duke. But Lord Whitmore is quite devoted. She looks pale, don't you think?" And she wanted to scream, to tell them all that she was dying inside, that their sympathy was suffocating her, that she couldn't breathe in this beautiful prison they had constructed around her. Whitmore led her to the dance floor, his hand proprietary on her waist. As they moved through the figures of the dance, he bent close to her ear. "You're trembling, my dear. Are you cold?" His voice was solicitous, but there was something underneath it, a note of satisfaction that made her skin crawl. "I'm fine," she managed to say, though it was a lie. She wasn't fine. She would never be fine again. She was going through the motions of a life that felt like a poorly fitted costume, and she didn't know how much longer she could maintain the pretense. The dance ended, and Whitmore escorted her to a group of matrons who immediately began discussing wedding plans with an enthusiasm that made Evelina want to flee. She smiled mechanically, murmured appropriate responses, and felt as though she were watching herself from a great distance. This couldn't be her life, this couldn't be her future. Somewhere, somehow, there had to be a way out, even if it meant running away with nothing but the clothes on her back and starting over in some remote corner of the world where no one knew her name. Then the music stopped. Not a natural pause between pieces, but an abrupt, jarring silence that rippled through the ballroom like a stone dropped in still water. Conversations faltered, heads turned toward the entrance, and Evelina, who had been staring at her hands to avoid meeting anyone's eyes, felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. The doors to the ballroom stood open, and framed in the doorway was a figure that seemed conjured from nightmare or dream. Tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in black, he stood with the stillness of a predator surveying prey. His face was harder than Evelina remembered, marked by scars that spoke of violence survived, his eyes burning with an intensity that made strong men take an involuntary step backward. But she would have known him anywhere, in any condition, across any distance. Her heart, which she'd thought had died months ago, suddenly roared back to life with such force that she gasped aloud. "Lucian," she breathed, so quietly that no one around her heard. But across the ballroom, through the crowd of frozen aristocrats, his eyes found hers, And in that moment the world contracted to just the two of them. Everything else, the shock rippling through the assembled nobles, the whispers of disbelief, the cries of recognition, faded into insignificance. He was alive. Against all reason, against all evidence, against the weight of months of grief and despair, Lucian Dravenhart was alive, and he had come back for her. Lucian moved into the room with deliberate steps, and the crowd parted before him like water before the prow of a ship. His gaze swept the ballroom, taking in the opulence, the shocked faces, the guilty consciences suddenly exposed. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the vast space, quiet but commanding absolute attention. "I apologize for my late arrival. I was unavoidably detained, by death itself, if the reports are to be believed." A ripple of nervous laughter quickly stifled. "But as you can see, those reports were somewhat exaggerated." Lord Blackwood, the King's Minister, had gone white as parchment. Several other nobles looked equally stricken. But Whitmore, after his initial shock, had recovered his composure. He moved to stand in front of Evelina as though protecting her, though from his perspective, it might have looked like he was protecting his claim to her. "Your Grace," he said smoothly, "what an extraordinary return. We are all delighted to see you alive, of course, though the circumstances of your disappearance and presumed death have been most troubling. I'm sure the King will want a full accounting." Lucian's smile was cold enough to frost glass. "Oh, I intend to provide exactly that, Whitmore. In fact, I have documents, witnesses, and evidence that will prove very illuminating regarding exactly who arranged for my disappearance." His eyes moved past Whitmore to fix on Evelina, and his expression softened imperceptibly. "But first, there is a matter of far greater personal importance that requires my attention. Lady Evelina, if you would be so kind as to speak with me privately." Evelina felt as though she might faint or fly apart, or simply dissolve into the air like morning mist. She tried to move forward, but Whitmore's hand closed on her arm, holding her back. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Your Grace. Lady Evelina is betrothed to me. Whatever your claims might be, she is under my protection now." The possessiveness in his tone, the barely concealed fury in his eyes, told Evelina everything she needed to know about what her life would have been like as his wife. Before she could speak, before Lucian could respond, her father pushed forward through the crowd. The Marquis of Greystone looked torn between relief at seeing Lucian alive and terror at the implications. "Your Grace, you must understand we believed you dead. The betrothal was arranged in good faith, under difficult circumstances. Surely you can see that we had no choice but to look to my daughter's future." "No choice." Lucian's voice cut through the Marquis's explanations like a blade. "You had every choice, my lord. You chose to accept my death without demanding proof. You chose to auction your daughter off to the highest bidder before my body was cold in its supposed grave. You chose convenience over honor, profit over loyalty." He took another step forward, and Whitmore was forced to either release Evelina or engage in an undignified physical struggle. He released her, but his face was dark with rage. Evelina pulled free and stumbled forward, barely aware of the hundreds of watching eyes, conscious only of the man standing before her. Up close, she could see the changes in him, the new hardness in his face, the shadows in his eyes, the scars that marked his skin. But underneath it all, he was still her Lucian, still the man she had loved with every fiber of her being. "Is it really you?" she whispered, reaching up to touch his face as though he might vanish if she blinked. "Are you really alive, or am I dreaming?" His hand came up to cover hers, pressing it against his scarred cheek, and the warmth of his skin, the solid reality of him, broke through the last of her defenses. Tears spilled down her face, and she didn't care who saw, didn't care about propriety or scandal or anything, except that he was here. He was real. He had come back to her. "I'm alive," he said softly, his own voice rough with emotion. "I'm alive, and I'm so sorry I left you to believe otherwise. I'm so sorry for everything you've endured in my absence." "You came back," she said, as though that explained everything, forgave everything, made everything right. And perhaps it did. The moment was shattered by Whitmore's furious voice. "This is absurd. You can't simply waltz back in here after months and expect everything to return to how it was." Lady Evelina is betrothed to me. The contracts have been signed. Her father has given his consent. You have no claim on her." Lucian turned to face him, and the look in his eyes made Whitmore take an involuntary step backward. "I have every claim on her. She was mine before your schemes bore fruit, and she will be mine again. As for contracts, I believe when one party is murdered, or so it is attempted, all prior agreements become void. Wouldn't you agree, Lord Blackwood?" He directed this last question to the King's minister, who looked as though he wished the floor would open and swallow him whole. Before Blackwood could respond, the King himself entered the ballroom. The assembled nobles bowed and curtsied, but the King barely noticed, his attention fixed on Lucian with an expression of profound shock. "Dravenhart, is it truly you?" The King was an old man now, his face lined with the burdens of rule, but his mind remained sharp. He had genuinely mourned Lucian's loss, for the young Duke had been not just a valued advisor, but someone the King had personally liked. Lucian bowed deeply. "Your Majesty, I apologize for the dramatic nature of my return, but I felt it necessary to make my reappearance in a setting where the truth could not be hidden or distorted. I have much to tell you about what transpired in the North, and about those who betrayed not just me but your trust." The King's eyes narrowed, moving from Lucian to Blackwood to the other pale-faced nobles scattered through the crowd. He was old, not blind, and he had survived decades of court intrigue by knowing when he was being lied to. "I see. Then we shall retire to my private chambers immediately, and you will tell me everything. Lord Blackwood, you will accompany us. As will you, Whitmore, since you seem to have taken quite an interest in the Duke's affairs during his absence." The King's tone made it clear this was not a request. As the men prepared to follow the King out, Lucian turned back to Evelina. He took both her hands in his, heedless of the watching crowd, and said clearly enough for all to hear, "Wait for me. I know I have no right to ask after what you've suffered, but I'm asking anyway. Wait for me while I set things right, and then if you'll still have me, I will spend the rest of my life making up for the pain my absence caused you." Evelina didn't hesitate. "I've waited this long, haven't I? I'll wait as long as it takes." She squeezed his hands, drawing strength from his presence after so many months of desolation. "Go. Do what you need to do. I'm not going anywhere." The confrontation that followed in the King's private chambers was brutal and exhaustive. Lucian laid out everything he had learned about the conspiracy, presenting documents, witness statements, and physical evidence that painted a damning picture of treachery at the highest levels of government. The mission had been a setup from the beginning, designed to eliminate a man who had become inconvenient to those who preferred a more malleable court. Lord Blackwood had provided the false intelligence, had ensured inadequate support, had arranged for the mercenaries who had attacked Lucian's company. Whitmore had financed parts of the operation and had been promised Evelina and access to Stormhollow's resources as his reward for participation. The conspiracy had extended even further than Lucian had initially realized. Several other nobles had been involved in various capacities, some providing information, others helping to suppress news of survivors, still others working to seize Lucian's assets once he was declared dead. It was a web of corruption that had ensnared some of the most powerful families in the kingdom, and as Lucian exposed each thread, the King's fury grew colder and more terrible. When Lucian finished, the silence in the room was absolute. The King sat in his chair like a carved stone figure, his face betraying no emotion, but those who knew him could see the rage burning behind his eyes. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Lord Blackwood, you are hereby stripped of your position and titles. You will be held pending trial for treason, conspiracy to commit murder, and various other crimes that will be detailed in the formal charges. Guards, take him away." Blackwood collapsed, pleading for mercy, swearing he had been coerced, that it wasn't his fault, that he had only followed orders from even higher powers. But the King was unmoved, and the former minister was dragged from the room, still protesting his innocence. The King then turned his attention to Whitmore, who had remained silent throughout Lucian's presentation, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. "Lord Whitmore, your involvement in this matter is clear. However, your title comes from an ancient lineage, and I am reluctant to see it destroyed. You will pay substantial reparations to the families of the men who died in the ambush. You will cede certain disputed lands to Stormhollow, and you will, of course, relinquish all claims on Lady Evelina Harrowell. The king's eyes were hard as flint. Consider yourself fortunate that I don't have you arrested alongside Blackwood. Now get out of my sight. Whitmore's jaw clenched, but he had no choice but to bow and accept the king's judgment. As he left, he cast one venomous look at Lucian, a promise that this wasn't over, that someday there would be a reckoning. Lucian met his gaze steadily, unafraid. He had survived worse than Lord Ronan Whitmore. When they were alone, the king rose and embraced Lucian, something he would never have done in public, but which spoke volumes about his genuine affection for the young duke. "I am sorry, my boy. I failed you. I should have questioned the reports more thoroughly, should have demanded a proper investigation. Instead, I allowed grief and the convenience of accepting their lies to cloud my judgment." The king's voice was heavy with regret. Lucian returned the embrace, surprised to find his own throat tight with emotion. "You were deceived by those you trusted, Your Majesty. The fault lies with them, not with you." They separated, and Lucian saw that the king had aged considerably in the months since he'd last seen him. The weight of discovering such extensive betrayal among his inner circle had taken its toll. "Nevertheless, I will make this right. Your duchy will be restored immediately, all assets returned, and I will personally ensure that those who sought to profit from your death face consequences. As for the Marquis of Greystone—" The king paused, seeing Lucian's expression shift. "Do you have thoughts on that matter?" Lucian chose his words carefully. "I believe the Marquis was more fool than villain, Your Majesty. He acted out of weakness and financial desperation rather than malice. Whitmore exploited his vulnerabilities. I leave his fate to your wisdom, though I confess I am more concerned with his daughter's welfare than with punishing her father." The king nodded slowly. "A generous assessment. Very well. I will have words with Greystone about his hasty decisions, but I will not ruin him unless you request it. Now go before that young woman storms my palace demanding to know what's taking so long. I've seen the way she looks at you, Dravenheart. Don't make her wait any longer than necessary." Lucian left the king's chambers to find the palace in an uproar. News of his return and the exposure of the conspiracy had spread through the nobility like wildfire. Some greeted him with genuine joy, others with carefully neutral expressions that told him they were calculating how to position themselves in this new reality. He paid them little attention, searching the crowded hallways for only one face. He found Evelina in a private sitting room, having escaped the chaos of the ballroom. She was standing by the window, staring out at the snow-covered gardens, and she turned when she heard the door open. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, and Lucian was struck by how much he loved her, how the months of separation and suffering had only intensified his feelings rather than diminishing them. "Is it finished?" she asked quietly. "The beginning of the end, at least. Blackwood is arrested. Whitmore is stripped of his claim to you and facing substantial penalties. The king has restored my titles and lands. Justice will be done." He crossed the room to her, and now that they were alone, away from the prying eyes of the court, he allowed himself to truly look at her, to see the toll the past months had taken. She was thinner than he remembered, her face marked by grief, her eyes holding shadows that hadn't been there before. "I'm sorry," he said, the words inadequate but necessary. "I'm so sorry for what you endured because of me, because of my enemy's schemes. If I could have spared you that pain—" She pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him. Don't apologize for surviving, for fighting your way back to me. Do you know what kept me going through all of it? The unreasonable, impossible belief that somehow you were still alive, that somehow you would return. Everyone thought I was mad, grieving myself into delusion. But I knew. My heart knew, even when my mind couldn't justify it." He captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm, then her wrist, feeling her pulse flutter beneath his lips. "I thought of you every day, in the worst moments, when I wasn't sure I'd survive, when the cold and the pain made it so tempting to simply let go. It was your face I saw, the promise I'd made to come back to you. That's what kept me alive." Evelina's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling, her first genuine smile in months. Then we're even, because you kept me alive too. My body kept moving, kept breathing, but my soul was waiting for yours to return. She stepped closer, eliminating the last distance between them, and rested her hand over his heart, feeling it beat strong and steady beneath her palm. I love you, Lucian Dravenhart. I loved you before, I loved you when I thought you were dead, and I love you now that you've returned from the grave. Nothing that's happened has changed that. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had begun to fall. And I love you, Evelina Harrowell. I loved you when I rode north. I loved you when I lay dying in the snow. I loved you through every moment of my return. I will love you until my last breath, and if there's anything beyond death, I'll love you there too. And then he kissed her, pouring months of longing and desperation and joy into that single moment of connection. The kiss was everything their first kiss had been and more. Tender but passionate, gentle but urgent, a claiming and a surrender all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Evelina laughed shakily. Well, that was worth waiting for. Lucian grinned, the expression transforming his scarred face into something approaching the man he'd been before. I should hope so, considering I travelled hundreds of miles through hostile territory to deliver it. His expression sobered. Evelina, I need to ask, can you forgive your father? He acted shamefully in promising you to Whitmore, but I believe he thought he had no choice, that he was protecting the family. Evelina sighed, her joy dimming slightly. I know he believed he was doing what was necessary, but he gave up on us so quickly, Lucian. He didn't even wait a full season before arranging the betrothal. It felt like my grief, my love for you, meant nothing compared to his political convenience. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I will forgive him eventually. He's my father, and I know he loves me in his way, but it will take time for me to trust him again, to believe that he won't sacrifice my happiness the next time circumstances become difficult. Lucian nodded, understanding. That's fair, and you should know that I've asked the king to spare him any serious consequences. Whatever his faults, I don't want to begin our marriage with your family in ruins. He took both her hands in his. About that marriage, I know everything has been chaotic and you've been through an ordeal that no one should have to endure. If you need time before we wed, if you want to wait and— No, Evelina interrupted firmly. No more waiting. I've done enough waiting to last a lifetime. I want to marry you, Lucian. Soon, as soon as it can be arranged. I don't care about a grand society wedding or months of planning. I want to be your wife, to begin our life together, to stop living in fear that something else will tear us apart. Relief and joy flooded through him. Are you certain? The scandal of a quick wedding after everything that's happened? Let them scandalize, let them gossip. I don't care what society thinks anymore. I nearly lost you forever, and I'm not wasting another moment of our lives worrying about propriety. She squeezed his hands. Besides, after your dramatic return from the dead, I don't think a hasty wedding will even register on the scale of shocking behavior. He laughed, the sound rusty from disuse, but genuine. You make an excellent point. Very well then, Lady Evelina. Will you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife with all possible speed? I will, she said, and sealed the promise with another kiss. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the private chapel at Stormhollow. It was a small affair by noble standards. Immediate family, close friends, and a few trusted allies. The king himself attended, a gesture that silenced any whispers about impropriety. Evelina wore a gown of ivory silk, simple but elegant, and carried white roses from the Stormhollow hothouses. Lucian wore his family's colours, and when he saw Evelina walking down the aisle toward him, his eyes shone with emotion that he didn't try to hide. The ceremony was brief, but deeply felt. When Lucian spoke his vows, his voice was clear and strong, promising to love and cherish Evelina for all his days, to protect her, to honor her, to make her happiness his life's work. Evelina's voice was equally steady as she promised to stand beside him through whatever trials life might bring, to love him in joy and in sorrow, to be his partner in all things. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Lucian kissed his bride with such tender passion that several of the ladies in attendance sighed audibly. Evelina wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing him back with equal fervor, and for that moment, There was no one else in the world but the two of them, finally united, finally beginning the life they'd both thought they'd lost forever. The wedding breakfast was held in the great hall of Storm Hollow, and despite the intimate nature of the ceremony, it was a joyous occasion. Toasts were made, celebrating not just the marriage, but Lucian's miraculous return and the justice that had been served. The Marquis of Greystone, looking considerably chastened, gave a speech acknowledging his failures and welcoming Lucian into the family with genuine warmth. Lucian accepted graciously, and Evelina watched the two men embrace, feeling some of the tension she'd been carrying finally ease. As the afternoon wore on and the guests began to depart, Lucian drew Evelina aside. "I have something to show you," he said quietly, taking her hand and leading her through the castle corridors. They climbed to the highest tower, and Lucian opened a door Evelina had never noticed before, revealing a small circular room with windows overlooking the sea. "I had this prepared for you," Lucian said, watching her face as she took in the space. It had been furnished as a private study, with a beautiful desk, shelves already filled with books, comfortable chairs by the fireplace, and most importantly, writing materials and space for her to pursue her own interests. "I know you love to read and write to study. I wanted you to have a place that was entirely yours, where you could think and work and be yourself without interruption." Evelina turned to him, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gift. In a world where wives were often expected to exist only as extensions of their husbands, this space represented something precious: recognition of her as an individual, support for her intellectual pursuits, trust in her abilities. "You did this for me?" "I did this for us," Lucian corrected gently. "I don't want you to feel confined or diminished by marriage. I want you to flourish, to grow, to become everything you're capable of becoming. Your happiness is my happiness, Evelina. Your fulfillment is my success. This room is just the beginning of building a life where we both can be fully ourselves." She kissed him then, trying to convey through the touch everything she felt: gratitude, love, joy, and a fierce determination to make their marriage everything it could be. When they broke apart, she said softly, "I have something to tell you. Something I've been keeping secret, waiting for the right moment." Lucian's expression shifted to concern. "What is it?" Evelina took a deep breath. "During the months you were gone, when I was engaged to Whitmore but kept delaying the wedding, I wasn't just grieving. I was also investigating. I didn't believe the reports of your death, not entirely, and I couldn't understand why everyone was so quick to accept them. So I started asking questions. Carefully, quietly. I used my father's connections, bribed servants, read correspondence I wasn't supposed to see." Lucian stared at her, astonished. "You were investigating the conspiracy?" "I was trying to understand what had really happened to you. I didn't have your resources or your military experience, but I had access to drawing rooms and social occasions where men spoke more freely than they should. I learned about Whitmore's debts, about his meetings with Blackwood, about payments that couldn't be explained. I didn't have enough proof to accuse anyone, but I had suspicions, and I was gathering evidence." She smiled slightly. "I even hired a former Bow Street runner to make inquiries in the north. He's the one who found Marta, actually, and learned that someone matching your description had been seen in that area months after you were supposed to have died." Lucian pulled her close, holding her tightly. "You brilliant, reckless, extraordinary woman. Do you realize how dangerous that was? If Whitmore had discovered what you were doing, he would have done what? Killed me? Then he would have lost everything he was trying to gain through our marriage. I was safer than you might think." She pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "Besides, I couldn't just sit idle while your memory was being erased, while your killers walked free. I had to do something, even if it was small, even if no one ever knew about it." "I know about it," Lucian said seriously, "and I am humbled by your courage and your faith in me. Did you know I planned to tell you this evening that I wanted you involved in managing the duchy, that I valued your intelligence and judgment too much to relegate you to embroidery and social calls? But I see now that I've married a woman who needs no permission to act, who takes initiative and risks for what she believes is right." Evelina grinned. "Is that a problem, Your Grace?" "It's everything I could have hoped for, Your Grace," he replied, using her new title with satisfaction. "We're going to do remarkable things together, you and I. Build something worthy of the sacrifices that brought us to this moment." They stood together in the tower room, watching the sun set over the sea, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Lucian wrapped his arms around Evelina from behind, resting his chin on top of her head, and they both savored the peace of the moment, the simple joy of being together after so much suffering and separation. "Tell me about the North," Evelina said quietly. "Tell me what really happened, everything you haven't said yet." So Lucian told her, holding nothing back. He described the mission, the growing sense of wrongness, the brutal attack, and the deaths of good men. He spoke of his own near death, of Marta's care, of the long months of recovery and planning. He told her about the darkness he'd felt, the rage and despair, and how thoughts of her had pulled him back from the edge. Evelina listened without interruption, her hand covering his where it rested against her waist, offering silent support. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Those men who died, their families are being cared for, I assume." "Yes, I've made arrangements for pensions, education for the children, dowries for the daughters. It's inadequate compensation for their loss, but it's what I can do." He paused. "Captain Thorne had a wife and 3 sons. I've promised that the eldest will have a position in my household when he's old enough, if he wants it. And I'm establishing a fund in Thorne's name to support veterans who are wounded or displaced." "That's good," Evelina said approvingly. "But I think we can do more. What if we created a school on the Stormhollow lands, a place where the children of soldiers and tenants could receive education regardless of their ability to pay? Knowledge is power, Lucian. If we want to create lasting change, we need to invest in people, not just provide charity." Lucian turned her in his arms, looking at her with wonder. "You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about many things. You're not the only one who's had months to plan for the future." She smiled up at him. "I know I'm young, and I know society will say I should focus on running your household and producing heirs. But I want more than that, Lucian. I want to matter, to make a difference, to use whatever advantages we have to improve the lives of people who don't have our privileges." "Then we'll do it," he said immediately. "We'll build your school and whatever other projects you envision. You're right. We have a responsibility that goes beyond just managing our own comfort, and I can think of no better partner for such work than a woman who investigated a conspiracy while everyone else told her to accept her fate and move on." They talked late into the night, planning and dreaming, building castles in the air that they both intended to make solid and real. They discussed modernizing the farming techniques on the Stormhollow lands, establishing a lending library in the local village, supporting promising scholars regardless of their birth. Evelina shared ideas she'd been developing for years, thoughts about social reform and education that she'd never been able to voice before. Lucian listened with genuine interest, asking questions, offering suggestions, treating her as the intellectual equal she was. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with them both. Lucian led Evelina to the Duchess's chambers, rooms that had been prepared especially for her arrival. They were beautiful, decorated in shades of blue and silver, but Evelina barely noticed the furnishings. She was focused entirely on her husband, on the miracle of having him here, alive, hers. Their wedding night was tender and passionate, a celebration of life and love and survival. Lucian was gentle, attentive to Evelina's inexperience, but there was also a desperation in their joining, a need to reaffirm their connection after so much time apart. They made love slowly, savoring each touch, each kiss, each whispered word of love. And afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, Evelina felt a peace she hadn't known since the day Lucian had ridden north. "I used to dream about this," she murmured against his chest. "Being with you like this, belonging to you, starting our life together. But then when I thought you were dead, I couldn't bear to remember those dreams. They hurt too much." Lucian's arms tightened around her. "And now?" "Now I want to dream new dreams, better ones. Dreams that we'll build together, that nothing and no one can take from us." She tilted her head to look up at him. "Promise me something, Lucian. Promise me that no matter what challenges come, No matter what dangers we face, we'll face them together. No more secrets kept to protect each other. No more bearing burdens alone. I promise, he said seriously. We're partners in all things now, Evelina. Equal in this marriage, equal in our work, equal in our commitment to each other. What affects one affects both. What threatens one threatens both. And what one achieves, both achieve. She sealed the promise with a kiss, and they made love again, slower this time, mapping each other's bodies, learning the landscape of pleasure and intimacy that would be theirs for the rest of their lives. The weeks and months that followed were not without challenges. The exposure of the conspiracy had sent shockwaves through the nobility, and there were those who resented Lucien's return, who had profited from his absence and now found their positions threatened. Attempts were made to discredit his evidence, to suggest that perhaps his ordeal in the north had affected his judgment, that he was seeing conspiracies where none existed. But Lucien had anticipated this, had built his case too carefully for it to be easily dismissed. One by one, those involved in the plot faced consequences. Some lost titles, some faced imprisonment, some simply found themselves ostracized by a society that had no tolerance for traitors. Lord Ronan Whitmore proved to be particularly vengeful in defeat. Unable to strike at Lucien directly, he attempted to damage his reputation through rumor and innuendo, suggesting that the Duke had orchestrated his own disappearance for political gain, that his marriage to Evelina was suspiciously hasty, that his reforms at Stormhollow were evidence of dangerous, radical thinking. For a while these whispers gained some traction, particularly among the more conservative elements of society, who were already uncomfortable with the changes Lucien and Evelina were implementing. But Whitmore made a critical mistake. He underestimated Evelina. She had learned during her investigation of the conspiracy that information was power, and she had continued to cultivate her network of sources even after Lucien's return. When Whitmore's campaign of rumors reached a fever pitch, threatening to seriously damage Lucien's standing at court, Evelina quietly revealed to several key society matrons certain facts about Whitmore's financial dealings and personal life that he had desperately wanted to keep hidden. Within days, the rumors about Lucien ceased, and Whitmore found himself fighting for his own reputation instead. Lucien learned about Evelina's actions only after the fact, and his initial reaction was a mix of admiration and concern. That was brilliant, but also dangerous. Whitmore is not a man who forgets slights. Evelina raised an eyebrow. Neither am I, apparently. Besides, he started this fight, I simply finished it, and I made sure everything I revealed was absolutely true and verifiable. I didn't stoop to his level of fabrication. She paused. Though I'll admit, I may have ensured that certain particularly damning pieces of information reached particularly effective gossips at particularly opportune moments. Lucien laughed despite himself. Remind me never to make you angry. Too late, she said cheerfully. You already did, when you got yourself nearly killed. I'm still deciding on an appropriate punishment for that particular transgression. They settled into a rhythm of life at Stormhollow that satisfied them both. Lucien managed the duchy's affairs and maintained his position at court, advising the king on various matters of state. But he also made time for the reform projects he and Evelina had planned, personally overseeing the construction of the school they'd discussed, working to improve conditions for the tenant farmers, investing in local industries that would provide employment and prosperity for the region. Evelina threw herself into her own work with equal passion. The school became her special project, and she was deeply involved in everything from curriculum design to the selection of teachers. She insisted on including subjects typically reserved for boys, mathematics, science, classical languages, in the education of girls, a decision that caused some controversy, but which she defended fiercely. She also established a fund to support promising students who wanted to continue their education beyond what the local school could provide. But perhaps her most important work was quieter and less visible. Evelina became known throughout the region as someone who would listen to grievances, who would advocate for those who had no voice, who would intervene when she encountered injustice. Women who were being mistreated by their husbands, tenant farmers facing unreasonable demands from other landlords, servants who had been wrongfully dismissed, all found in the Duchess of Stormhollow an ally who combined genuine compassion with the power and connections to effect real change. One case in particular demonstrated the kind of partnership Lucian and Evelina had built. A young woman from one of the villages came to Evelina with a desperate story. She had been promised to a man twice her age, a brutal drunkard who had already buried 2 wives under suspicious circumstances. The woman loved someone else, a young farmer's son, but her father was determined to go through with the more advantageous match. Evelina brought the case to Lucian, and together they investigated. What they discovered was a web of debt and obligation. The father owed money to the older suitor, and the marriage was meant to cancel the debt. Lucian quietly paid off the debt himself, removing the financial pressure. Evelina then worked with the local vicar to arrange a marriage between the young woman and the man she actually loved. The father was furious initially, but when he realized that his daughter would be provided for, and his debts were cleared without sacrificing her happiness, he eventually came around. It was a small thing in the grand scheme of the kingdom's affairs, but it mattered. And there were dozens of similar cases, small interventions that collectively made Stormhollow a place where people felt protected, valued, and heard. Their happiness was completed when Evelina discovered she was with child. The announcement brought joy to the entire household, and Lucian was beside himself with excitement and anxiety. He became absurdly protective, trying to prevent Evelina from doing anything that might be remotely strenuous. She tolerated his fussing with patient amusement for about a week before sitting him down for a frank conversation. "Lucian, I love you, but if you don't stop treating me like I'm made of glass, I'm going to hurt you. Women have been having babies since the dawn of time. I'm healthy, strong, and perfectly capable of continuing my normal activities. So unless you want to spend the next several months sleeping in the guest chambers, you need to trust that I know my own body and will ask for help if I need it." Lucian had the grace to look sheepish. "I'm sorry, you're right. It's just, after nearly losing you, the thought of anything threatening you or the baby terrifies me." Her expression softened. "I know, and I appreciate that you care so much. But fear can't rule our lives, love. We both learned that lesson the hard way, so let's make a deal. I'll promise to be careful and to listen to my body, and you'll promise to trust me and not hover quite so intensely. Agreed?" "Agreed," he said, and pulled her into his arms. "Though I reserve the right to occasionally hover, it's a husband's prerogative." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Evelina continued her work almost until the day she went into labor. The birth was long and difficult, as first births often are, but Evelina came through it with her characteristic strength. When Lucian was finally allowed into the room and saw his wife holding their daughter, his vision blurred with tears of joy and relief. "A girl," Evelina said softly, looking down at the tiny, perfect face. "I hope you're not disappointed." "Disappointed?" Lucian's voice was rough with emotion. "How could I be disappointed? She's beautiful. You're both beautiful. You're both perfect." He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, one arm around Evelina, one finger gently touching the baby's cheek. "What shall we name her?" They had discussed names extensively, but now that the moment had arrived, Evelina knew exactly what felt right. "Grace. I want to name her Grace, because Grace is what brought you back to me, what sustained me through the darkest times, what has blessed our life together." "Grace Dravenhart," Lucian said, testing the name. "It's perfect. She's perfect. And you, my extraordinary wife, are the most remarkable woman I've ever known. Thank you. Thank you for our daughter, for our life, for not giving up on me when everyone said you should." Evelina leaned against him, exhausted but happier than she'd ever been. "Thank you for coming back, for fighting your way back to me, for being the man I knew you were, for building this life with me." She looked down at their daughter, who had fallen asleep with the sudden completeness of newborns. "She'll grow up in a better world than we inherited, Lucian. Between the two of us, we'll make sure of that." The years that followed were full and rich. Grace was joined by 2 brothers, and the halls of Stormhollow rang with the laughter and chaos of children. Lucian and Evelina raised them with love and high expectations, teaching them that privilege came with responsibility, that power should be used for service, that character mattered more than title. The school Evelina had founded flourished, producing graduates who went on to distinguished careers in various fields. Several of the young women educated there became teachers themselves, carrying forward Evelina's vision of education as a path to empowerment. The reforms implemented on the Stormhollow lands became a model that other progressive nobles began to emulate, slowly spreading better practices throughout the region. Lucian's standing at court remained strong. The king, impressed by how Lucian had handled both his return and the subsequent administration of his duchy, increasingly relied on his counsel. When the old king finally passed and his son took the throne, the new monarch retained Lucian as an advisor, valuing his integrity and wisdom. Lucian used his influence carefully, always working to advance policies that would benefit the common people as well as the nobility. There were still challenges, of course: political opponents who disagreed with their reforms, economic downturns that tested their resources, personal griefs and losses that reminded them of mortality's shadow. Lord Whitmore remained a persistent thorn in their side for several years, until he finally overreached in some financial scheme and found himself forced to flee the country to avoid prosecution. They heard years later that he had died in exile, bitter and alone, and Evelina felt only pity for a man who had wasted his considerable talents on greed and revenge. But through everything, Lucian and Evelina remained each other's anchor and strength. They had learned too well the value of what they had to take it for granted, or allow it to be threatened by petty concerns. Their love, tested by separation and betrayal and death itself, had emerged stronger than they could have imagined. They still took time away from their duties to simply be together, to talk and laugh and make love as passionately as they had in the early days of their marriage. On the anniversary of Lucian's return, they celebrated it every year along with their wedding anniversary, they would climb to Evelina's tower room and watch the sunset over the sea, just as they had on their wedding day. It became their private ritual, a moment to reflect on how far they'd come, how much they'd overcome, how blessed they were to have found each other. On the 20th anniversary of his return, as they stood in the tower with silver beginning to thread through their hair and laugh lines deepening around their eyes, Lucian pulled Evelina close and said, "Do you remember what I promised you the night I came back? That if you would still have me, I would spend the rest of my life making up for the pain my absence caused you." "I remember," Evelina said, leaning into his embrace. "Though I told you then and I'll tell you now, you had nothing to make up for. What happened wasn't your fault. Nevertheless, I made the promise. And I want you to know that I've kept it, or tried to. Every day of our marriage, I've woken up grateful for you, determined to be worthy of you. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Evelina Dravenhart. My love, my partner, my equal in all things. Everything good in my life, everything I'm proud of, has been built on the foundation of us." Evelina turned in his arms, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "And you are mine. You've given me a life beyond anything I imagined in my wildest dreams. Not just the title or the comfort or the beautiful children, though I treasure all of that. But you've given me the freedom to be fully myself, to pursue my passions, to make mistakes and learn and grow. You've treated me not as a possession or a decoration, but as a person with my own mind and will. That's the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." They kissed then, as deeply and tenderly as they had when they were young newlyweds. The years had changed them. Lucian's scars had faded but never disappeared, reminders of what he'd survived. Evelina's hands bore the marks of practical work rather than the softness expected of a duchess, but those changes only made them more precious to each other. They knew what it cost to build something real, something lasting, and they protected it fiercely. As the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in glorious shades of red and gold, Lucian held his wife and thought about the boy he'd been, the man he'd become, the life he'd nearly lost and miraculously regained. He thought about the soldiers who had died in the north, whose sacrifice he honored by living well and justly. He thought about his children, who would carry forward the legacy he and Evelina were building. And he thought about the woman in his arms, who had refused to give up on him even when the entire world had declared him dead. "I love you," he said quietly. "Today, tomorrow, and beyond whatever comes. Nothing will ever change that." "I know," Evelina replied, her voice equally soft. I've always known. Even in the darkest times, I knew. And I love you just as much, just as permanently, just as completely. They stood together as the stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky. And in that moment, in that place, surrounded by the life they had built together and the love that had sustained them through every trial, they were perfectly, absolutely, eternally happy. Behind them, the lights of Stormhollow blazed warm and welcoming. Below them, in the village, families gathered for evening meals. Children ran through streets that were safe and prosperous. Students studied by lamplight in their homes, dreaming of futures that were possible because of the Duke and Duchess who cared enough to make them so. This was their legacy, not just the children of their blood, but the community they had nurtured, the lives they had touched, the changes they had made in their small corner of the world. And it all began because a man refused to die, and a woman refused to believe that he had. Because love, real love, is stronger than death, more powerful than any conspiracy, more enduring than any trial. Lucian and Evelina had proven that truth with their lives, and their story would be told for generations. A tale of betrayal and return, of loss and recovery, of two souls who found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from the ruins of tragedy. As they finally left the tower hand in hand, walking down the ancient stone steps toward their family and their future, the moon rose over Stormhollow, casting silver light over the castle, the lands, and the sea beyond. And if anyone had been watching, they would have seen that the Duke and Duchess still moved as one, still fit together perfectly, still carried themselves like people who knew exactly how lucky they were, and never took a moment of it for granted. So, dear listeners, what did you think of this story? Did you feel your heart race when Lucian appeared at the winter ball, alive against all odds? Did you ache for Evelina during those terrible months when she believed the man she loved was gone forever? Did you cheer when justice was served and the conspirators faced their reckoning? This is the power of true love. It endures beyond what seems possible. It survives tests that would destroy lesser bonds, and it emerges from trials not weakened, but strengthened, tempered like steel in fire. Lucian and Evelina's story reminds us that sometimes the greatest romances are not the easiest ones, but those that require us to fight, to believe, to hold on, even when every reasonable voice tells us to let go. Their love changed not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others. The children educated in their school, the families protected by their advocacy, the community enriched by their leadership. That's what real love does. It doesn't exist in isolation, treasured and hoarded like gold in a vault. It radiates outward, touching and transforming everything it encounters, creating ripples that spread far beyond the two people at its center. If you enjoyed this journey through heartbreak and triumph, through betrayal and redemption, through death and resurrection of the soul, I would love to hear your thoughts. Did you have a favorite moment? Was there a scene that particularly moved you? Perhaps you related to Evelina's refusal to give up hope, or to Lucian's determination to reclaim everything that had been stolen from him. Please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, so you never miss another story like this one. Share this tale with someone who loves romance, who believes in the power of love to overcome any obstacle, who needs to be reminded that sometimes miracles do happen and the dead do return. Leave a like if Lucian and Evelina's story touched your heart, and comment below with your reactions. I read every single one, and I treasure knowing which parts of these stories resonate most deeply with you. Remember, behind every great love story is a choice. The choice to believe, to fight, to endure, to forgive, to love even when it's difficult. Lucian chose to survive and return. Evelina chose to wait and to hope. Together, they chose to build something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. And that, dear listeners, is a lesson worth remembering in our own lives. Until our next story, may you find your own version of Lucian's courage and Evelina's steadfast heart. May you love deeply, fight fiercely for what matters, and never give up on the people and dreams that make life worth living. Thank you for listening, for feeling, for joining me in this tale of love triumphant. Subscribe, like, share, and I'll see you very soon with another story that will sweep you away to worlds of passion, adventure, and romance. Until then, keep believing in love's power to conquer all.